Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Rationally Speaking with me and my colleague, Stuart Carrington. I nearly said friend there, Stu, which would have been embarrassing and sort of highly inaccurate.
Well, Ellis was a big believer in accurate language, but I was, concerned I got promotion then.
Yeah, you nearly made it into the friend zone.
Into the Turner Circle of Trust.
Let meet the parents.
Good spot. You understood my reference. Which is a
Okay,
nice way
okay.
of us to segue into what we're going to be talking about today, because I wanted to introduce the listeners to how REBT can influence how we see films and film characters. And I've got a rather nice example to share with everyone.
You take it away then, Stu.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to share some slides with everybody now. Okay, so for those of you that might be listening just to our audio, we will talk through each of these slides, and hopefully those of you that are watching on a more visual medium such as YouTube, you'll be able to see what's ahead of you. And what Martin and I really wanted to do when we sort of were thinking about these podcasts, we wanted to kind of avoid making this, this kind of very formal, educational, kind of lecture-based session. It's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to kind of just represent the sort of general chats that we have around REBT. But that said, I think it would be kind of beneficial for the listener just to kind of familiarise themselves with the interdependent framework that I've taken from Martin's book, The Rational Practitioner. Nice plug for you there, Martin. So seeing it is your framework, I know you've drawn, from Ellis, this, so you certainly want to kind of cite him there, wouldn't you, and not claim it as your own. But would you mind giving us a nice little kind of overview of this framework?
Yeah, sure. So Ellis really comes up with this in 1994, sort of formally writes about it. And what I've done is kind of, I suppose, articulate it and maybe expand it a bit, go into a bit more detail. But this is what we call the GABC framework. And its basic premise is the idea that your goals, the adversities you face to those goals, your beliefs about that adversity, and the consequences you face as a result of all that, they're all kind of interconnected. So G stands for goals, A is for adversity, B is for beliefs, and C is for consequences, our emotions, our behaviours. Now, usually when people are talking about RBT and writing about RBT, they would talk about the ABC, the idea that it's not the adversity itself that automatically causes these emotional and behavioural consequences. It's our beliefs about the adversity, but also our beliefs about ourselves, the world, and other people that really drives some of those consequences that we see. So you would often see ABC. But the thing is, A, the adversity is only adverse to the extent that it detracts from a goal that we've got. Now, we might be aware of that goal. We're able to articulate it and say, I'm aiming towards X. Or the goal is just implicit. We all have goals as human beings, even if it's this kind of innate sort of survival-based goal. There's still some goal there being acted upon. So that means that we can take that framework and kind of get a feel for how this GABC plays out in the real world and how we can work with each of those aspects. And one of the things that I realised that I went back to Ellis's work and understood that he realised was that if you change any of these components, all of the rest of them change. So what I mean by that is in RBT, traditionally, we'd be looking to help people to weaken their irrational beliefs, hopefully strengthen, develop and strengthen their rational beliefs, hoping to help them to shape the consequences they experience when they face an adversity. You can work with any of these things in RBT. You don't just have to work with B. And that's really important because it gives us lots of options in terms of practice, applicability, and also just being proactive. So, for example, we're working with somebody and they're constantly hitting a wall. They're upset, they're angry, they're hurt, they're anxious because they're trying to pursue a goal and they just keep hitting these walls. So traditional RBT would kind of start to look at their beliefs a little bit. And so, what is it about what you're telling yourself about the world, about yourself, about other people that is generating these kind of unhealthy emotions and these unconstructive behaviours? But with this framework, we can take a look at G. We can start to understand, well, actually, are your goals in the right place? Are you aiming towards the right things for you as a human being? We can take a look at A and start to figure out, are there any changes you can make that can actually reduce the amount of adversity and the nature of adversity you actually face? And then we can look directly at C. We can say, okay, when you're experiencing that emotion, is there a way we can dampen it down and try to manage it more as it's occurring, you know? And of course, we can focus on B as well. Because the reason you can focus on each of these is because each of them has a knock-on consequence to each other element. You change G, you change a goal, you change the adversity that you face, and therefore changing the beliefs, and therefore changing the consequences. You change the adversity, you obviously remove, the kind of relevance of B. If B is about A, if you remove the A, then B becomes irrelevant. Therefore, C changes. So, of course, specific RBTs we would call it. It is very Elysian. We have a strong focus on B if B is present, if B is extracted, articulated by the individual. But general RBT, we get to focus on G, A, B, and C and do a broader work with the individual. We're not just locked in to work around beliefs. Mm-hmm. So what you can see on that slide there, and for people listening, we have the G, A, B, C, and they're all interconnected. They're all connected to one another, rather than traditionally the A, B, C being quite linear. It goes A, then B, then C. Actually, it's more of a cross. Everything's connected to each other, and that's probably the most appropriate way to view this.
Thanks for that, Martin. Hopefully those of you that are listening to this and can see the framework ahead of us can see how flexible REBT is. And this particularly lends itself to REBT being a very applicable and practical approach to try to minimize somebody's discomfort or distress. And to this end, we wanted to kind of show this framework in practice. And I just thought of this example, which I'm really excited to share with everybody because hopefully people get some enjoyment out of it. And perhaps it's one that people necessarily wouldn't have thought of as a way of a vehicle of showing this framework in action. But we're going to look at kind of each part. Oh, excuse me, I jumped ahead. We're going to look at each part of this framework through the lens of Dodgeball, a true underdog story, or as I've labeled it here, a true REBT story. So hopefully the listeners and viewers here are familiar with the film Dodgeball. If you haven't, you should definitely check it out. And I'm not being paid by whoever made this film to say that. So we've got kind of two main antagonists in the film. So on the screen here, on the first one, we've got White Goodman. And White Goodman is a complete narcissist. And his character can be summed up by this quote of his here. It's only your fault if you don't hate yourself enough to do something about it. So there's elements of REBT in here because REBT kind of does promote like responsibility. But what REBT doesn't do is it doesn't promote blame, which White Goodman certainly does. He's like kind of blaming people, thinking, well, it's your fault. Like you should be doing something about your flaws. And in his particular case, somebody's flaws is all about their physical appearance. So if somebody is overweight or not physically fit, he sees that as something you should be ashamed of. And you can see the sign in the background of his gym there. He's got the Shame Reduction Center at Globo Gym. So he's very much driven by this goal of his, which is kind of, I want to be this peak physical specimen. And to not be that peak physical specimen would be awful. So that there's the adversity. And his belief is, I should be physically fit. Everyone should be physically attractive. And the consequence of that, the emotional consequence would be shame. And the behavioral consequence to that might be, so if you are feeling shame, might be kind of avoidance and kind of self-depreciation, awfulizing. So it would be awful. I would hate myself or should hate myself if I'm not in this peak physical condition. And then we have the other kind of antagonist, which is Pete LaFleur. And Pete LaFleur, here played by Vince Vaughn in the film, he kind of also represents REBT, but not in a positive way at first. So he says, I found if you have a goal that you might not reach it, but if you don't have one, you're never disappointed. And I got to tell you, it feels phenomenal. So Pete's just constantly looking for the easy road. So he just kind of like meeks his way through life, taking the path of least resistance always. And it's not really getting him anywhere. So his business is failing. He's not succeeding in anything. His goals aren't helping him. But what they are doing is kind of like removing any adversity, because he's never striving to achieve anything at all. Martin, I'm happy to carry on, but do you have anything you want to contribute about these characters?
I think particularly Pete, if you want to remove the pain of not having achieved your goals, then one of the easiest options you can have is to either reduce your goals in terms of how high you want to aim, or don't have any goals at all. That's an assumption that people make, that that's an easy route, but that doesn't really lead anywhere good.
Mm,
That's like a hedonist's solution. Well, I can kind of remove anxiety and hurt and pain and anger by just removing my goals, just aiming really low.
mm,
And I think, yeah, I mean, that can work in the short term, but as a long term solution, that's not very good, because these things are unavoidable, and you have goals that you can't articulate and you don't really know about, so
mm,
you'll hurt anyway.
mm,
So that's a really interesting kind of solution, REBT solution centered around G,
mm.
that we would say is tempting, but actually doesn't lead to anything good in the long term. And in terms
Absolutely.
of White Goodman, it's sort of like that shame piece can be a powerful motivator.
Mm,
The avoidance of shame can be a powerful motivator. But again, how long lasting can that motivation be?
mm,
Yes, it might be powerful in the short term, but I don't think it's sustaining in the long term.
mm. And I think that's something that we're going to see as we progress through this story. So here we've got this wonderful. We can look at other aspects of the interdependent framework here. So for those listening, the slide depicts White Goodman, and one of the behavioral consequences that he wants to avoid, because he must not be physically out of shape. He must be in peak physical condition all the time, or he would be ashamed, he would be worthless, he would self-depreciate. Is he tries some kind of traditional behaviorist approaches to avoid eating foods that might not contribute to his goal. In this case, he's eating a slice of pizza. And what we see when he's doing this is he's doing some kind of interesting self-talk. So he's telling himself that, he wants the pizza, doesn't he? And he should eat the pizza. And he's trying to kind of like test his willpower and stubbornly refuse it, which Ellis kind of used this word, sort of stubbornly refuse to make myself resilient to certain things. But what we also see White doing later on in a wonderful scene with Ben Stiller is he puts electrodes on his nipples, so he gives himself an electric shock every time he wants to eat a donut, to try to create some kind of negative conditioning to sugary or fatty foods. So this is a good example of how some individuals might choose to focus only on the C. So the consequence of those actions. So the consequence of White's beliefs are I must not eat fatty foods. So therefore, I'm going to kind of target that behavior and condition myself to not do so. Now, this is what Ellis kind of referred to as the difference between feeling better and getting better. So feeling better might be, okay, well, if I avoid or resist eating that slice of pizza or that donut or whatever it may be, like I'm going to kind of feel good about myself, because I've overcome a strong desire to eat something fatty or sugary or whatever it may be. But this is the difference. It's not actually targeting those beliefs that create that shame, that create that potential self-depreciation, and that promote the adversity in the first place. And as Martin alluded to, like, we can't really avoid like adversity all the time. Like, kind of negative events are going to happen in our life and they're going to be unpleasant. So if we only focus on the C, it might not result in long-term benefit. Now, we might experience some short-term gains from it. So White, in this instance, is in kind of good physical condition, and he is succeeding in avoiding those sugary foods. Those of you that have seen the film probably know where I'm going with this and know what the end slide's going to be. But long term, and Ellis was very keen to promote what he labelled long range hedonism, which is, what can I do to promote a generally happy life, and how can I minimize my discomfort? It doesn't normally serve well to only focus on the C. Martin, any views?
I think that there's a sort of an element of behaviorism. We have to remember that REBT is cognitive behavioral framework. Behaviorism is in there. This idea that actually what you would do is you would sort of punish yourself for your desires, and when you think in a certain way or move towards a certain thing, you would punish yourself. Is a very sort of behaviorist solution. Again, great for short term potentially. For sure, would stop you in the moment from doing something that you don't necessarily want to do. But again, how sustainable is that over the long term? It's more sustainable to shape your beliefs, shape your habits around the things that will lead to long-term contentment and satisfaction. And
Perfect.
that's
Yeah.
where the beliefs in this framework kind of become quite important.
And I think that's what you were referring to at the beginning about this specific and an elegant kind of REBT. So now we're going to go on to, at this point in the film, for those who can see the slides, we've now got Lance Armstrong talking to Pete LaFleur. And this is happening in the midst of a dodgeball competition, because White's goal of owning Pete's gym, they've decided to enter a dodgeball competition and to kind of like settle this dispute, as we all do, and that's how we all settle our disputes, I imagine. Now, there has to be a little bit of artistic license here, because Lance Armstrong is the vehicle that's used in the film to promote virtuous living. Now, I think that some people might seek issue with that, but just for the purposes of the film, the purposes of discussion, let's take that as kind of gospel and take that as true. So Pete actually wants to run away. So he doesn't think that they can beat Globo Gym. Like kind of everything's going wrong in the competition. White's particularly manipulative because he's very goal driven, and Pete doesn't really see that he has a chance. So he's actually going to kind of bail out and quit on his team at this point. And he has this wonderfully kind of inspirational chat by Lance Armstrong about kind of just doing the right thing. And this really kind of picks up on the philosophical flavour of REBT. And I think this is what Ellis really tried to promote in this particular approach. There's this strong philosophical thread that runs through this theory. And this particular philosophical thread sort of stems from Stoicism. And it's important to note that Stoicism isn't something that suggests we should be emotionless. Rather, that Stoicism is about promoting individual responsibility on our emotions and trying to minimize and not contribute to our own distress or discomfort, and also promote more healthy emotions. But a healthy emotion can be negative sometimes as well. So Pete here learns that what might actually promote his happiness isn't always to run away from an issue, but it might be just to try to do the right thing. Now, of course, you might succeed, you might not, but you know that you did the right thing, and that will alleviate the distress of negativity. Because, as mentioned, unfortunately in life, negative events are bound to occur, and we can't always avoid them. And it's through this conversation with Lance Armstrong that Pete learns, I need to do the right thing. And perhaps we have this kind of like moral should, these kind of like moral conditions that if we live virtuously, then we will overcome any adversity, maybe quicker, but perhaps easier, and we certainly minimize our discomfort when it does happen. But also, we promote the likelihood of succeeding or doing the right thing. Martin, your thoughts as always.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting person to use, isn't it? As the voice
It
of,
certainly is,
of
yeah.
virtue, Lance Armstrong. But I think the stoicism coming through there is so interesting. One of my favourite kind of Epictetus teachings, Epictetus being, famous, Stoic philosopher from the ancient world, a teacher in Stoicism from the ancient world. If it's not right, don't do it. That's such a difficult thing to actually practice, isn't it? Because it's where is the sense of wrong or right? Well, the Stoics felt that the right was moving you towards being more virtuous. So if you have those principles and those virtues and you take them seriously, then you can question yourself as to whether your action in this moment, your decision in this moment, moves you towards virtue, moves you away from virtue.
Mm.
We can talk about the four virtues at a different time, but fundamentally, it's like that kind of having that compass, isn't it? And thinking in this moment, okay, what's going to move me towards virtue? What's the right thing to do in this moment?
Mm.
Um, and you often see this in films. This moment in the film where the kind of the lead character has to make that kind of decision.
Mm.
Do I go for something that's glorious but not virtuous,
Mm.
but something that's virtuous and in the end becomes more glorious? You know,
Mm.
that external reward versus that internal growth. You will
Mm.
see that as a through line in lots of films, lots of literature. How that intersects with REBT, for me, is within that goals dimension.
Mm.
So when we're working with people with that interconnected framework, that interdependent framework that we introduced at the start of this, when you're working with G and you're helping people with their goals, then it's often a good place to start is virtue
Mm.
or values per se. What are you aiming towards from a values perspective? Not just the gold medal, not just winning this and gaining that. Actually, from you as a human being, in terms of your contentment over a long period of time,
Mm.
what journey do you want to go on? And then we can figure out what adversities might take place. And
Mm.
then we can figure out what beliefs you might have that might be counteractive to those outcomes that you desire. And we can figure out the consequences of facing some of those adversities through your beliefs. So again, you're at the front of this, being proactive, helping somebody to shape their goals around something that I think is essentially and ostensibly stoic.
Mm.
So it's certainly an interesting moment in the film, and as I said, one that's shared across various films in lots of genres.
Mm. Yeah, you can almost sort of like think of examples like popping into your head straight away of people that suddenly sort of decide, might do the right thing. And like I said, there's that challenge there. And I think for Pete in the film here, the challenge is, well, this kind of goes against his whole kind of philosophy or approach to life thus far, which is kind of take the easy way out and not have a goal because then you avoid any disappointment. And he knows at this crossroads, he can choose to do the right thing, but it might lead to disappointment because he might lose. Now has something to lose, but he chooses to do the right thing, of course. And long term, that's going to promote this long range hedonism that Ellis discusses. So
That's what's
that,
nice about
oh, sorry, go
REBT as well, Stu.
on.
It's the kind of there's no reason to avoid adversity.
Mm.
If you recognise that it's not the adversity itself that causes how you feel,
Mm.
causes you being upset, causes your anger, causes your anxiety. If you recognise that, then it means you don't need to avoid them.
Mm.
There's things to be gained by facing adversity, especially if it's forthright and especially if it's voluntary.
Mm.
To voluntarily go into something difficult and to get your beliefs in order
Mm.
so that no matter what happens, you know that it's not the end of the world. It doesn't go against some kind of obligation that I have to succeed. It doesn't mean anything about you as a complete human being. If I fail here, it doesn't mean I'm a complete loser. So to
Mm.
fortify yourself first and then actively choose to go into
Mm.
these adversities, that's where growth can take place. So
Mm.
RBT is a good framework in terms of helping people to face challenges and hopefully go into those challenges relatively fortified, not
Mm.
blindly, but fortified, so that no matter what happens, you can kind of maintain that health.
Mm.
It's not causing unhealthy negative emotions. Of course, you're not going to be happy when you fail and when you're let down. That's not the goal of RBT. Happiness isn't the goal. So I think it kind of captures some of that as well in a way. This part of the movie.
Absolutely, and that leads me on to this slide. And again, for the listeners, what we're seeing here is Pete is in this kind of final duel in the dodgeball match with White. And what Martin was just talking about fortifying against like kind of potential adversities, I think is really important because as we keep kind of going back to is, okay, we can remove adversity, but unfortunately, these things are going to happen, these negative events. And so what can we do to prepare ourselves as best we can? And interestingly, Pete's now kind of done this with his approach, his newfound approach to doing the right thing and virtuous living. White hasn't achieved it yet. So White's he doesn't achieve it at all, does he? So he's constantly just looking at his goal and how he achieves that, and then looking at behaviors and sort of the consequences to help him kind of achieve these things. Now, at this scene, I'm not sure if you remember this, Martin, but Pete says to White just before they have the final kind of it's like a one-on-one dodgeball, kind of one throw each kind of a thing, and the first person to get hit loses. Pete says to White here, your ass looks really fat in those pants. Now, for White, whose belief is I must be in perfect shape all the time, this really throws him off. This has like this huge like kind of emotional consequence because he starts to become really overly concerned and worried about that comment. So he hasn't prepared himself for this kind of event that someone might say something or someone might negatively judge his appearance in any way at all. And of course, no one's under any obligation to appraise you positively in anything. But this kind of really distracts White from what's going to happen. And of course, White ends up losing. And when White loses this competition, this is the consequence. So this is what happens. Now, White here has turned into this complete kind of slob that goes against all of his beliefs previously that we've established during the film. And he loses the gyms and he loses all of his money, etc., etc. And he starts binge eating and comfort eating, and then this is the result. And of course, it's done for like kind of comedic effect. But this is what happens when we just focus on the C's. So it might make us feel better in the moment, but he never challenged his B's. He never challenged that belief that to be seen as worthy, you have to be physically perfect or physically attractive or in perfect shape or anything like that. He always associated worth and value with the physical aspect. And by never challenging that belief, it's like building your house upon the sand. Whereas Pete, on the other hand, never kind of did that. And he's realized now he just wants to kind of live virtuously. And he ended up succeeding. And this quote, which is Pete's kind of almost like final line in the film, I think this really sums it up for me. So his gym, Average Joe's, he says, you're fine the way you are. But if you'd like to get in shape or you just want to make new friends, come to Average Joe's, his gym. And this, for me, is really representative of Ellis's concept of universal self-acceptance, but also universal other acceptance, which is you can accept how you are for your flaws. And that doesn't mean that you don't take any personal responsibility to maybe kind of, develop or improve anything in any way. But what it does do is saying, well, you might not be in perfect shape, but that doesn't mean you're worthless. You just look at the action, you look at the behavior. Maybe you could do with doing more exercise or being more physically fit, but that doesn't make you a worthless human being. That doesn't make you useless in any way. And now Pete is really acknowledging this. So he's emphasizing that preference. So look, you're totally acceptable the way you are. You have worth, you have value as an individual, and that's enough. But you might like to do X, you might like to do Y. And in which case, this is the appropriate environment for you to do so. So he's kind of now built this shrine to this accepting environment, to this place where you can have these preferences and they don't judge the person. So this is very different from judging a behavior. I'm particularly now interested in your final thoughts around the message of REBT and Dodgeball.
Yeah, really interesting, Stu. I think White's character, this is the danger of aiming towards something that is externally valid. If I set my goals and my course of trajectory towards a place that is externally valid, how I look, my reputation, how much money I've got, then you're always at risk. It's precarious because the world is uncontrollable and you're fallible and limited. You're not perfect. So if you prize that, then you make yourself more vulnerable to adversity. And if you haven't addressed your beliefs, then when you do face that adversity, it's going to feel quite catastrophic, and you're going to have this huge impact emotionally and behaviourally. And then from Pete's perspective, where he lands at the end, I think one of the interesting things that you realise when you're working in spaces where there are a lot of really talented individuals, say elite sport or something like that, where you are around people that actually are very, very talented and have honed their craft and very highly skilled. One of the things that helps them to buffer that stress, that pressure, that expectation of being at that level is to understand that actually they're just a normal person that's good at something, and that because they're a normal person, they're not perfect, and they will fail, and they will face setbacks, and they will face letdowns, and they might be dropped next week, and they might be injured the week after. So it's not necessarily like an average Joe mentality, but the point is there's a common nature to us all in that we're humans. It's that humanness part of unconditional self-acceptance. So it's not just I accept myself regardless of what happens. It's I accept myself as a normal, fallible, imperfect human being. So it's acceptance and recognition of that, isn't it, that kind of Pete lands on in the end. And as you said, extends to others, creates that climate where it's okay to be who you are in this environment. And it comes from him. It comes from that journey that he's been on through the film, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and we see this in a lot of sports psychology literature, and I think REBT, is this film kind of provides, is a nice way of providing that platform. Well, I guess that's a nice kind of review, isn't it, of Dodgeball, but particularly from a lens that people may not have considered before. Thank you so much for discussing it with me, Martin.
Hey, Norris, thank you for bringing that example to the table. Really interesting, and it kind of is really in line with the conversations that we're normally having. I'm glad that we've decided to actually record these things. If any listeners of yours have got any suggestions as to what we should check out, if you think it might fit with the REBT framework, we'd certainly be keen to take those suggestions, and maybe it will feature in a future video podcast.
That'd be great. It'd be really interesting to discuss that. I'm sure I can think of many more kind of film and musical examples to do so.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stu. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll both see you at the next one.
Thanks, Martin. Bye, everyone.